So we've had another mass shooting by a young man, and everyone's yelling incel this and incel that. Is this justified? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Ontario, Canada. You're listening to Canadian Intelligence, eh? Podcasts and interviews with interesting people about national security. It feels good to be back, folks. My summer vacation is over. I've had a chance to think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and I've decided that indeed there's more things I want to talk about and more people that I want to talk about them with. And so we're back to these Canadian Intelligence A podcasts. Not even 2 weeks ago, there was a mass shooting in the United Kingdom, in Plymouth, which is very rare for that country because they don't have the kinds of guns ownership that we have here in North America. And so having mass shootings is a very, very rare occurrence. This one was a bit different, though. A young man killed a bunch of people, and it turns out in the immediate aftermath of the killings of 5 people, he also killed himself, injured 2 other people. The media picked up on the fact that he was an incel, or involuntary celibate. This is a term that we hear a lot about these days, and increasingly there are concerns, including here in Canada, that incels are somehow terrorists and that they pose the greatest threat to national security. To unpack all this, I've decided to bring back, for I think the third time, the one person on this planet to whom I go on all things incel, because she is the expert as far as I'm concerned, and that's Naama Kates. She runs a podcast on incel. She has interviewed hundreds of these people and has written a great op-ed piece in The Unheard, which is an online news site, entitled What the Media Gets Wrong About Incels. So, Naama, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be your first guest back. We've missed you.
Thank you. So here are the facts, Naama. On the 12th of August, and we're recording this on the 23rd, so not even 2 weeks ago, there were shots fired in Plymouth, in England, and a 22-year-old named Jake Davison had killed his 51-year-old mother, left the house and killed a 3-year-old girl and her 43-year-old father. Then he shot and injured a 53-year-old woman and her 33-year-old son in a park. And then he killed a 59-year-old man, where he then also wounded a 66-year-old woman and then killed himself. Now, you were following this quite closely because, as I said in the introduction, a lot of people were screaming incel about this. So, but before we go on, Naama, can you just remind my listeners what an incel is and why people seem to be so concerned about this phenomenon, if I can call that these days?
Sure. And I think that's as good a word as any to use, phenomenon. People say movement, ideology, subculture, gang, lots of nouns being used to describe that. And that's kind of a contention I have sometimes. But basically, an incel, as you said, an involuntary celibate. The broadest definition is someone, usually a young man, though there's some dispute over whether women can be incels, but usually a young man who is involuntarily celibate, as in he doesn't have sexual or romantic relationships despite wanting them. That's kind of the broadest definition. But when we're talking about incels, we're more or less talking about people who kind of congregate online to an extent, or they chat online on online forums and things about their condition. There's some, language they have in common. There's like something kind of akin to an ideology called the black pill that they talk about. And there's a lot of self-pity, a lot of misogyny, a lot of kind of really reprehensible rhetoric in these communities. And finally, there have been a few, and the number is also very debatable, but certainly some mass killings linked to incels, to this group subculture movement, and a lot of talk about whether it's terrorism when these things have happened.
Right. So, when I first met you, Naama, which was, I think, a couple of years ago, I didn't know anything about the term incel. And I believe I read somewhere where actually it was a Canadian woman some time ago who actually invented the term. Am I right in saying this is a relatively recent phenomenon in the sense that, there's always been young men who, quote unquote, want to get laid and couldn't. and are not happy with it. But this phenomenon per se, is it a relatively new thing?
Yeah, it's a very new thing that the history is kind of, a winding path, beginning with the coining of the term, as you mentioned, in 1992. That was Alana Boltwood. But incels, as we know them now, kind of came about around the same time that 4chan and a lot of social media apps that we use did too, like Reddit and YouTube and things like that. But it's really been the last 5 years, I would say, that's been a term anyone has heard of. It started, there was the Isla Vista shooting in 2014, followed by another one in 2015 in Oregon that were associated with incels, and that's kind of when it really got started.
And the first one was Elliot Rodgers, I believe, and he
Yes.
killed a number of people. This thing has really assumed an disproportionate attention, I would say, Naama. I want to kind of go back to the piece that you wrote for Unheard, again, entitled What the Media Gets Wrong About Incels. And the subtitle was Coverage of the Plymouth Attack Has Been Reckless. So can you walk my listeners through why you think that this assumption, if I can use the term, that this young man, David, what was his name? Jake Davison, was in fact an incel. Some of the reporters went through things he posted online. There was talk about the so-called black pill. Why is it that you're pushing back against this young man being an actual incel, and in this case, a violent incel? Because I know you've done a lot of work, and you have stressed that the vast majority of self-identified incels are nothing. They're not even nearly violent. It's a very, very small percentage that are violent. What did the media get wrong on this one?
Well, I think my main objection was that the coverage of it was about him being an incel, sort of to the exclusion of everything else. And that, in my opinion, and the talk became, this is an incel killing. So it's not just whether or not he's an incel, but it becomes the motivation for the attack, the reason he did it. Everyone starts to focus on how dangerous this group is and how we need to take them more seriously, quote unquote, whatever that means. So I think that by the categorical definition, Jake Davison probably was an incel, in the sense that he was involuntarily celibate. And I also think that he obviously had familiarity with the group, with the language, with the community, with some elements of the black pill. But he didn't he went out of his way, in fact, to clarify that he didn't consider himself an incel in one video, because I've watched all the videos as well as read his entire Reddit post history, which is quite a lot. He never openly states that he's an incel. He was active in subreddits that were sort of devoted to debunking incel ideas like the black pill, and at times he would talk about how he didn't believe in them. So to say that he was, and how it was nonsense and everything, I don't know, there was just a range of emotions he had about it. It didn't seem that he was that familiar with it as others have been in terms of the way he spoke and everything. So to me, most of all, whether or not he was an incel is kind of irrelevant. If we're talking about what motivated the attack, that's not it, in my opinion, not at all.
Okay. I want to pick up on that because you made an interesting point. He didn't self identify as an incel. Now, you and I have spoken in the past. You know that my focus is on terrorism, and I would submit that very few terrorists self identify as terrorists, and yet we would label them as such depending on the reasons for their act of violence, whether they had actually followed groups online. Do you think it's really important from this perspective that one self-identify as an incel, or is it okay for others looking at his Reddit posts, his online activity, to classify him as such? I mean, where's the distinction there?
Well, a terrorist, to, go back to your example, to your point, they wouldn't identify as a terrorist, but they would identify as a jihadist, right? A Salafi
Mm-hmm.
jihadist,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever else the ideology was. They would claim that to an extent. They would have to, because if they commit some kind of violent act in the name of something, it's very important to sort of claim this is an act in the name of this greater cause. You know, I
Right, right,
ascribe
right.
this act to this greater cause, this belief that has some end goal. So, yes, I do think it's important, because otherwise, if we're just going by the categorical definition, then anyone who's not sexually active and spends time online and then commits some kind of atrocity, we can say that's an incel killing. And that
Right,
doesn't really do us much good.
right. Let me get back to the victims. So he kills his mother. So this is an act of matricide. He
Hmm.
kills a 3-year-old girl and her father. He kills a 50 or he injures a 53-year-old woman and her 33-year-old son. He kills a 59-year-old man and finally a 66-year-old woman. I'm sorry, Naama, but I'm guessing that if in fact he was actually an incel who was angry at women who would not have sex with him, these are not the people he's angry at.
No.
They're older people. There's a 3-year-old girl,
Yes.
for God's sake, his own mother. Is there something inconsistent in that? In your study of incels and the very small fringe who are violent, do they tend to target the very people that they think are, refusing to have sex with them? Is it really that laser focused when it comes to that?
Well, no, it's not. And that's the other thing, when you're talking about terrorism, who the victims are matters. But at least in some of the cases where they weren't necessarily targeting only women, or it wasn't that well thought out, or, giving it a little bit of leeway, the Elliot Rodgers and the Chris Harper Mercers and a couple other examples, the hot yoga shooting, things like that in Florida, they were at least targeting, it was their college campus. So it wasn't necessarily the women that refused, but it was the kids, the group, the clique, sort of the popular cliques that refused. So there was that too. With this attack, I mean, one thing that I found conspicuously absent was any evidence of planning of this. No manifesto, no kind of leakage as far as we know. Of course,
Like Elliot Rodgers left a huge manifesto or a video manifesto, I believe, right?
yes, both a long 150-page manifesto and YouTube videos. Um, I think the ones that legitimately were motivated by some kind of misogynistic ideology do that. They kind of leave some footprint of announcing to do that. And Davison didn't do any of that. I don't know that there's much evidence that this was even planned or that he was even suicidal. Like I've spoken to people and had some little arguments with people too that claim that, oh, he was going after these targets because it was the women, like the little girl, and then the men, if they were with them, he saw them as their protectors or something. And that's just a stretch. This seemed like, as the police initially said, that they ruled out terrorism. Initially, they said that. And it seemed to be a domestic incident that spilled out onto the street. I think that sounds right.
So it would be your conclusion based on the research that you've done that the allegations or the accusations, rather, it's almost like it's, the jury has already ruled that
Yes,
Mr. Davison was an incel. So you think this is completely wrong.
I do. I think that the thing that I think that is most wrong about it is that this focus on whether or not this person was an incel and whether or not incel culture is to blame, it's worth looking at, right? I'm not saying that it isn't. I'm not saying that it isn't very worth taking a serious look at the effect that these ideas and these echo chambers have on people. I've always kind of believed that and stated that. But I think that if you're looking for an explanation for violence, I don't think you find it there in this case. And I think that that ultimately takes away from our ability to understand these things and how to prevent them.
Exactly. I mean, you want to be open to all possibilities, and that when you look at the evidence, you make a decision based on on what the evidence leads you to. Can you speculate, Nama, on why you think this has become sort of the soup of the day for many people in terms of violent extremism? Of course, we had an attack in Toronto a year and a half ago. The man was charged with terrorism. You are very familiar with the Alec Manassian case, as am I. In Toronto in 2018, I believe, the judge ruled very strongly that she felt that the
Yes.
incel angle was widely
Yes.
disproportionate to that. Why do you think this has become the thing to go to when young men carry out acts of violence? It seems like all the young men are potential incels. Why now?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have a few ideas about that. One of them is just kind of the political and cultural climate that we live in, and I'll get to that in a second. I mean, I think the first um, explanation, I think, is just that when these things happen, it's shocking and it's unfathomable, and nobody can understand it, and it's terrifying, and people want a simple explanation, a linear sort of monocausal explanation. Oh, this is this dark ideology, this is an incel killing, because then if you address that or get rid of that, whatever that is, then you feel like you've gotten rid of the problem. And so I think there's just a tendency toward wanting something, a simple, closure, rather than living with the uncertainty and complexity of this and how this actually happens.
And most things in life are very complex, but we tend to defer to simplicity.
Yes, exactly. It's just a tendency, the way our brains are sort of wired to do that. But yes, most things are very complicated, especially things like this. Um, and then the second reason, I think it's just to do with how kind of politicized we've started to make everything. Everything is used to kind of score political points, political points about one issue or another. Let me grab her.
That's okay. It sounds wonderful. It's adding a bit of levity to a very, very deep, dark, deep subject.
I can't. Yeah, so I think in the world right now, we're using all kinds of serious issues to politicize them and kind of gain political points in one direction or another. And I think that incels fit into right now. Obviously, the world the world is there. Baby, you sound brave, but give me a second, please. um, Now, the world is very polarized, and there's a lot of panic about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And I think that um, incels sort of awkwardly fit into this dichotomy of um, things that people are very concerned about now, which is like far right and fascism and misogyny and racism and all of these issues that are uh, just everyone's kind of consumed by them now. So I think for a lot of people, incels represent this oppressive boogeyman in a sense, and they're not extended a lot of empathy.
So you're drawing a relationship between the violent incels and the far right. Is that a well established link? I mean, I know a lot about the far right and I know a little bit more about incels thanks to your work, but I wouldn't draw a one to one mapping between the far right, in general, and the violent incel movement, would you?
So yeah, there is overlap between the far right and incels culture, and a lot of people see that and point to it as examples that one is kind of a gateway to the other, and it's not. I mean, they both kind of came about, they grew at the same time. There's a commonality of language, of being shocking, of having sort of counter to the mainstream political views. And there's an overlap in the misogyny element of it, or rather the anti feminist, anti progressive kind of element. Um, there's also I mean, in my opinion, there are some sort of characterological similarities to them too, but they're very different movements. They're very different. I mean, I wouldn't call incels a movement again. They're very different groups. They have a different culture. I think that, well, I saw some references over the last week to the fact that incels actively recruit, which I just want to go on the record saying is really false. I mean, that doesn't happen at all. That there is a little bit probably of recruitment from other movements into incels. I have heard a little bit of that happening, but I think it's just kind of an easy population um, to go after, you know, from many groups. I mean, I feel like one thing incels are kind of right in is that they are they're not given empathy because they're supposedly privileged for having, male privilege and things like this. But in reality, they're very sort of dispossessed people. A lot of them aren't personally successful. They don't have big friend groups or, really supportive sort of social systems. There's no pride in being an incel, really, and there is in the far right groups. I mean, that's
For
part of
sure.
what they're all about.
Absolutely. Nama, you and I have talked in the past about how this violent fringe to the incel, whatever you want to call it, phenomenon movement. I don't know what the proper word is. It's very, very, very small. Now, when stories like this come out and allegations are made that in this case, Mr. Davison was in fact an incel, he was violent, he killed 5 people, he killed himself. What impact does this have on the greater number of people who often go online to commiserate together on why they can't have meaningful relationships? Does this put them at risk in terms of, are they then seen as they're the next Jake Davison, or they're the next Elliot Rodger, next Alec Manassian? Do you see any reflection in the community that, like, holy shit, holy shit, now everyone's going to think that I'm the next guy to pull out a gun or a knife or get in my car or whatever and start killing people? Does that fear exist within the community?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've always seen that whenever something happens, they talk about, if you go on their forums and everything, they start talking about, oh man, this is the end for the website. It's going to go down. Uh, like FBI, if you're reading this, like, oh, okay, I'm already on a list. There's a lot of paranoia. Some of it's joking, some of it's, a little bit more serious. But the the scrutiny and the way people talk about them in the public square online, which is now, we can say, social media, Twitter, and places like that, it really goes into sort of a frenzy when one of these things happen. And you certainly get a lot of pushback. I mean, one thing that I would argue for people who want to call for censorship and things like that is that, um, if people really speak like this and say that incels are terrorists, publicly talk about them that way as this boogeyman, and want to shut down their spaces, for the ones that have a sense of like persecution or a victimhood narrative, that definitely confirms it even further. So I don't think it's advisable.
So this is, at a minimum, this is not helpful, and at a maximum, we could see people start pointing fingers and accusing those who have serious issues with, whether psychologically or with relationships or their place in the world. They're going to say, well, we need to fear you because who knows when you're going to be the guy that snaps one morning and gets up and decides to kill because he can't engage in these meaningful relationships then.
Yeah, and these are already people who feel that way. Incels talk about how people think of them as creepy in school, they're outcasts, they're bullied. Lots of them, like you said, do have a lot of mental health issues or developmental issues like autism spectrum. Huge proportion of those. I always say it, but I think it's important to note that is vastly overrepresented in the incel community. So these are people that are already feeling that way to an extent, feeling, unseen at best and villainized, or vilified at worst. Um, it's a group that I think would normally be sort of an obvious one to be empathetic to, and yet, you know, there's none of that. They
It's
are,
quite the opposite. And
yeah,
no one feels sorry for them. We're just saying you're evil and it's all about sex for you and you're misogynist and you hate women and all kinds of things. And why would we help you when you're such an evil individual?
yes.
Wow. So where's this all going, Naama? I mean, are we just, are we going to have the same podcast a year from now when there's another shooting that's someone's accused of being an incel? Do you see any ground swelling of support to do something more, I don't know, final or more definitive against this? Or are we just, this was the news of the day 2 weeks ago because of, as I said, mass shootings in the United Kingdom are rare, unlike
Yeah.
unfortunately in your country and in my country. Is this a blip on the radar and then we're going to go move on to something else?
I mean, sometimes it really feels that way. We've got such a fast news cycle. Now there's Af- Afghanistan being
Afghanistan, of
completely
course. Yeah. Yeah.
taken over by the Taliban. And I felt like this story was kind of drowned out by a lot of that news. So maybe. But on the other hand, I think that there might be an effort to take it more seriously, as people say, by categorizing incels as terrorists, and any kind of incel related act as a terrorist act. You mentioned, the ruling by Justice Anne Malloy, I think, on the Manassian case. Um, and that was, I think, a really judicious one, because I think maybe if it had gone in a different direction, incels would have been classified as terrorists in Canada. I did want to ask you about that, but and now they're doing the same thing in the UK, and I think if that continues, well, I don't think these people are going to go away, and I don't know what this is going to do. And I will ask you about that once you. I don't know if you wanted to kind of wrap up for your.
Yeah, let's do that, and then we'll go on to yours. But
Okay.
Nama, I could talk to you for days about this, and you are right. You talk about Afghanistan and the Taliban, and as I've been trying to remind people time and time again, you look at terrorism, real terrorism as we all understand it. Last year, for 2020, for which stats are available, I think there were 14,000 people killed in acts of terrorism. 13,900 were killed by jihadis. So, in the last by a disparate group of actors, maybe some of which could be classified as incel or not. But let's not miss the forest for the trees here. There are other actors out there that are much more dangerous than a handful of people who, through frustration or getting to the end of their line, decide to go out in a blaze of glory, as they see it, like Mr. Davison. But Naama, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you. You are the go-to person when it comes to incels, as I remind everybody on the planet. And I'm going to share your op-ed piece in Unheard, as well as your link to your podcast. So thank you so much again for joining me on this podcast to talk about an important issue that I agree with you, a lot of people are getting wrong.
Well, thank you. It's always my pleasure to talk to you too. And thanks for sharing the article too. I know that there's a lot of media coverage still saying the opposite. It's a bit of a strange feeling to be aware that I'm kind of making a statement that is so much in the minority, but it's interesting.
Well, it's important, I think, for people like you to make that. I think it really is. People need to see that there is an alternative to what the mainstream media is saying. So thanks again, Naama.
My pleasure.
So that was my conversation with Naama Kates. You've heard her on my podcast before about incels and violent incels. What do you think of the attack in Plymouth? Do you think it was something that was tied to the incel movement? I'd love to hear your feedback. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @borealisaves. You also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like the content, want to get more, go to the website, borealisthreatrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get all the podcasts, all the blogs free of charge through your inbox. All you have to do is sign up. There's also a link there to my latest book, The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. Self-published. You can only get it from my website. I'll talk to you again real soon. It's great to be back, guys. Until then, stay safe.